Do you ever feel like your female ancestors have, well, just vanished into thin air? You are not imagining it. Women often left fewer clues in the historical records, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to find them. In this video, I am sharing with you 26 records and record types that you might be overlooking in the search for the women in your family tree. Hey there, if we haven't met before, I am Lisa Lisson with Are You My Cousin, a genealogy expert with over 15 years experience helping people find their ancestors. On this YouTube channel, I share my best strategies, tips, and resources for uncovering your family history and building a healthy family tree without being overwhelmed. Now, I love jigsaw puzzles, so it's probably no surprise that, well, I love genealogy as well. Because oftentimes in my research, the two don't really seem all that different. Tracing female ancestors can feel like putting together a puzzle when the pieces are missing. Yes, we know that they left behind fewer records or fewer mentions in the historical records. Sometimes they might just be identified by a husband's name. That's why today I'm going to be sharing with you 26 resources and record types that are often overlooked in our research for the women in the family tree. It's my hope that these tips and these resources will help you uncover those clues to the women in your family tree that might actually be hidden in plain sight. Now let's get started. As I go through the list, there is no particular order for the list indicating that one record type might be a higher priority or a better resource for you than others. This is literally just a list. Some of these will be applicable to your research, some of them will not. But we want to start thinking and be aware of the many places that could potentially be out there that we can use to find the women in the family tree. The first resource that I have for you are the records at the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. They have an extensive collection of family histories and records that can be helpful in your genealogy research, so you definitely want to make sure you are checking those out. Now, next up we have women's societies and clubs. Local historical societies may have records for some of the local women's clubs and societies that have been in the area over the years. The vertical files at the local library may have records of these as well. But just remember, our women, they had lives outside of the home, and so it's potentially you could find them in some of their hobbies and their causes that could be helpful to your research. Alumni associations. Women's colleges do have alumni records that you might be able to research or access, particularly older ones, maybe not so much the more modern records, but consider things like a women's college, a newspaper, the school newspaper, the college yearbook. Those are the types of records that we're talking about. Consider using teacher certification records. State archives will often hold these types of records detailing female educators. Also consider medical and midwifery records. This is not a record set that I personally have used very often, but you would want to check with the state archivist to see perhaps who might house those and how you might be able to access those. Now, another one would be hospital records. Now, I say this and I want to qualify this quite well. Older hospitals that are no longer around, so these would be much older records, may be available for you to research. Say, the records may have ended up at a state archive somewhere or a local archives, so you could check to see what might be available. However, state privacy laws can restrict your access to some of these records regardless of how old they are. I know in my personal research, I'm able to access certain records in one state, but just across the state line, there's no way. I'm not allowed to access them. So this is not the record that you're going to go to for first, but for completeness, check and see what perhaps the state where you're researching might have for the earlier time periods. Next up, be sure and check court records. Now, court records are actually pretty common resource for us as genealogy researchers. I love to read the court records because, well, that's where our ancestors like to air the dirty laundry, right? So they can be quite a fascinating read just for general research purposes. But when it comes to women could be sued as well. If a woman figures prominently in a case, you may find her mentioned there. So make sure you are not shying away from court records. I know they can be a little tedious to go through sometimes. There's a lot of just sitting and reading and sifting through those documents, but make sure you are including court records when it comes to searching for the women in your family tree. And then there are, of course, the divorce records that are out there. So not every marriage of our ancestors was ended happily ever after, right? And so our women were able to get divorced. Now, when it comes to looking for divorce records for your ancestor, you do need to understand the time period that you are researching And that will dictate oftentimes where you will find the actual divorce record. So make sure, again, if you're going after those types of records, if you have any kind of clues about your ancestor having divorced, then you will want to make sure you understand what type of record would have been created for that divorce and where it would be housed. Now, researching female ancestors can be a bit tricky sometimes when it comes to planning your research. And that's part of what we do in a VIP day experience here at Are You My Cousin? Now, learn more about the VIP day experience at lisalisson.com/VIP-genealogy. And I will have a link for that in the description below as well. Next up, check the guardianship records. Now, these are typically part of the death record collections and come into play when a woman lost her spouse, so her husband passed away, and she had young minor children still in the household. So the guardianship records are very helpful and can delineate family relationships, as well as help you to put together family units. Next, city directories. And if you have watched me for any length of time here on YouTube, you know I love a good city directory. I love going through directories of any type to find an ancestor. And city directories are often underutilized when it comes to looking for women in the family tree and finding them in a time and a place. So I would encourage you to use the city directories. I actually have a full blog post on that. I will be happy to put a link to that in the description below if you want to read that later about city directories and all the different details, including women, that you can find in its pages. Now consider next to check employment records. You want to check for records that might have landed in an archives or a local repository for things such as factory workers, the mills, other industries that might be local to an area. They may have records, they may have employment records, they may have yearbooks that are unique to their company. Check the archives and local library for perhaps potential records there. Now we're going to round out the first dozen, the first 12, number 12, with census records. Now don't roll your eyes just yet. Yes, census records are a very basic beginning genealogy record that we all use. I get that. But I hear from a lot of folks, especially if you're new into your research, you're stuck. You get to those pre-1850 census records where only the head of the household, which is usually the male, is mentioned, and researchers will kind of shy away thinking, oh, this is where it gets really hard. I can't find the women in the family tree there. Yes, you absolutely can find the women in those pre-1850 census records. You may have to do a little math because they may just be a tick mark, and you've got to sort of start sorting things out as to potential birth dates, etc. But they are in the pages, and we just need to make sure we're using those records to get the clues to help us find that female ancestor. Okay, so let's head on for the second dozen that we have here as well. Consider looking at what we would call a poorhouse record or records for the poor, depending on where you live. They may have a different name, but states and counties and states did keep these records. Oftentimes I find them in an archive. They're typically not digitized, I will tell you that, but they can be very helpful in helping you place a woman in time and place and to find her. Unfortunately, a large number of folks in these lists tend to be women. And so you definitely want to make sure you're including those poorhouse records as part of your genealogy research for the women. Orphanage records. Now, the type of information of what you might find will certainly vary for that. And again, you may come up into some privacy issues there. But depending on the time period that you're researching, you may find some evidence there in using orphanage records. If you have women in your family tree who entered religious life, then check for those church records or those convent records. Those are an opportunity for you to document women who perhaps maybe did not marry or who were, again, part of a religious order. And don't forget to look at church membership list, because these would have included perhaps a church directory of sorts, but they would also indicate perhaps a baptism or a marriage date in them as well. Now, don't overlook this next one, which would be researching the county and state tax list. Typically, we do think we're going to be more likely to find our male ancestors in those, but you will find on occasion some of the women in the family tree that might be listed, particularly if they were widowed. So don't overlook the tax list just because typically we would look we're typically looking for the male ancestor in those. Don't overlook them as a potential source for finding a female. Check the homestead applications. Now, this is not one that I have personally used. My personal genealogy research does not go into that direction, but be sure and check those for the women, perhaps out there in the Western states. Society pages would be my next place to go look. As you guys know, newspaper research is something that I truly enjoy. I enjoy reading through those historical newspapers. I enjoy doing deep searches into those resources to find my ancestors in the newspapers. And absolutely, this is where you want to be looking for the women in your family tree. So I call them society pages, but I think the probably better term would actually be to say community pages. The section in the newspaper where it's detailing what the local citizens are doing, who's visiting whom, maybe who got sick, who won the spelling bee, those types of things that are going to be mentioned. This is where you can start to find you're going to find a better cross-section of men and women in the family tree. Next up, I want you to look at the section of the newspapers that's detailing the various clubs and local societies that are in the community. What are they doing? Oftentimes, women were involved in charitable organizations, and this is where you are going to find evidence of that. And it's not just about the charitable organization. This tells you what is important to your ancestor, kind of some of their causes. But oftentimes you would find women, multi-generations of women in the same family in doing the same type of charity work. They were in the same societies, the same clubs. So you want to check out the part of the newspaper that is talking about what these societies and clubs and organizations are doing. And then the next part that I want you to make sure that you are looking at would be the legal section in a newspaper. So this is the type in the newspaper where they are making public notices of maybe there's a settlement of an estate. Maybe there's somebody for whatever court case it could be pending and they need to make a public notice for a certain number of times, for a certain period of time. This is where you can find women listed right alongside the men in the family in those legal documents. So it's another way of helping to put people in place and time, to put people in groups together. So make sure you are checking out those that legal section as well. Another type of resource that you could be including in your genealogy research would be ethnic society records. Organizations for specific ethnic groups often either had their own societies that had their records, they created their own newsletters, they might have created their own newspapers as well. These are the types of records that you want to include in your research when it comes to looking for the women. Next up would be pension applications. Now, this is a common type of record that we might use and that we see in our genealogy research. But I want to make sure that when you are focusing on the women in your family tree, that you are looking at those pension applications, not just for the male ancestor, but for his wife as well. So there could be a widow's pension application. It could be that she's just named in a pension application. So make sure you are including the pension applications, if applicable, for the time period in your research. Now, number 24. So here we are already at 24 places and resources that you could potentially find your female ancestors. Have you looked at Red Cross volunteer records? This is a really unique set of records that have an amazing amount of information in them about women. Many women volunteered and were part of the Red Cross during wartime, and the Red Cross records are very good. They can be very detailed about the women who have joined. So you want to check and see if those are available. I do find these on some of the genealogy databases. And so I would absolutely encourage you to check these out if they are during the right time period for your own genealogy research. And we've done 24 places and resources to look for female ancestors, and I've got 2 more for you because, well, I have 26, right? So number 25, guys, is personal papers that you might find in a special collection, say at a university library or a state repository. These are fascinating. University and society archives often hold collections of personal papers that do include information on the women in a family. So don't shy away from exploring special collections for those personal papers. And for number 26, we have published family histories. Family histories can provide you with the clues that you need to progress your genealogy research. Now, I always like to give a little caveat, a little caution, if you will, that when you're reading the family histories, you want to make sure that you are verifying the information before you add it to your own family tree. Definitely, you might find mistakes that have happened in the past, or if you're finding them on a family tree online, or if you find that actual written publication, Just make sure, is it well sourced? Is it documented? And does it make sense to go into your family tree? But don't shy away either from using them as clues. This is sometimes, even if there might be an error, you might pick up on a clue that could help and benefit your research. 26 records and resources that you can use to find the women in your family tree. And if you want to learn even more about finding the women in your family tree, watch the video on your screen now. They weren't lost, just hiding.